Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Chintan Vaishnav. He's a very interesting chap. He is an MIT faculty on leave to head India's Atal Innovation Mission. This means that he is the big boss who's supposed to build India's innovation system. Welcome, Chintan.
Thank you very much.
All right, Chintan. So we are talking about startups, and everyone hears a lot about startups these days. What exactly are startups, and why is there such a big deal about this strange animal called startups? Or these strange animals called startups?
Well, that's seemingly very simple question is not that simple. What we have found is that there is this new kid on the block, a new type of economic entity, but there is no consensus on how it's defined across the world.
Very quickly, is it really much ado about nothing? Because businesses have begun since time immemorial. The Phoenicians were traders, the Harappa, Mohenjo-daro dwellers, basically the Indus Valley civilization, they were traders. The Mesopotamians were traders. The Egyptians and the Greeks traded. They created businesses. There was demand for supply, demand for goods and services. So what's new?
So there are some fundamental differences. So think about 5 components. The type of legal entity this is. You're right. Anything that's big was small at one point in time. So even the large corporations. But does that make them a startup?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of 5 dimensions, what type of an entity this is legally? What is the age of this entity? What is the size of this entity in terms of revenue? Those first 3 are in common with any type of business. But there are 2 more dimensions. One is how scalable is this entity? The conventional trading businesses are not necessarily all scalable, nor do they have to scale. But how scalable it is, how rapidly can it scale? And second, is there a component of innovation in this? So for instance, if I am a trader and I am going to start a mom and pop shop, typically these shops have a very clear understanding of a unit economics that I put in so much money and I have so much return and so much time. And if it works out, then I will replicate. And my returns are going to be proportional to how many such outlets I have. This is in some ways McDonald's, for instance.
I see.
But when you add the component of innovation, I'm not saying McDonald's at this point doesn't have innovation, that it also has innovation. But if you
they give you heart attacks and diabetes, get a Big Mac and Coca-Cola, buy one get one free.
You said it, not me. But if you start with innovation, then I think what differentiates these new types of entities, the startups, is that there is a good bit of scientific or technological uncertainty.
Got it.
That you have to overcome, and it may take time. But once you overcome, then you can scale rapidly.
Understood. So a classic example would be Google
or Amazon. Take Amazon. 19 years.
Yeah.
It was making losses.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's possibly going to be one of the largest corporations we will have for a longer time.
Understood. So basically, you use technology, you come up with a solution to a problem, and that solution scales up, and that is what differentiates, say, an Amazon from a family trying to sell shoes in some little town in any part of the world.
Greater technological or scientific uncertainty, business model uncertainty before you get there.
Okay, brilliant. So, got it. So, you're using technology, you want to scale up. So, a good example of a startup is, of course, Amazon, but Uber, Google, so many unicorns appearing in India,
Facebook,
China, elsewhere.
India.
Yeah, those are startups. So, talk about India's innovation system, because you are drafting policy for the transformation of India. Apparently, that's the full form of NITI, correct?
That's right. NITI, where the innovation mission of India, called the Atal Innovation Mission, is based. NITI is a very clever acronym. NITI stands for policy. NITI stands uh, um, for just policies. Um, and NITI is an acronym for National Institution for Transforming India.
Good. So now that we are talking about transformation, and we've already touched upon unicorns, and unicorns are in the news in India a lot. You hear about Lenskart, you hear about Ola Electric, you hear about them all the time. So what is the India story?
Yeah. Well, unicorns get people's attention, so people talk about them. But I think, to me, the cornfield that's growing is at least as important as unicorns are. In India, for instance, there are 115 unicorns, but there are close to about 100,000 startups, almost 99,000 plus at this point, that are registered startups with the government of India's startup registry. So, and this has happened in the last decade or so, with emphasis on recognizing this new type of entity and making it a part of various industrial sectors. I have to start by saying that yes, there's a lot of excitement. India's startup ecosystem, one would say, is the third largest startup ecosystem in the world after the United States and China. But we're still only, in my estimate, we're only about 1/10 of the way flat on our journey to.
Why do you say that? Because there's a lot of hype everywhere in the media here. So why do you say we're only a tenth of the way there?
I'd say that because there are 100,000 startups for 1.4 billion people.
And that is not a big number.
That's about
in percentage terms.
Right. That's one startup for 14,000 citizens. Now, if you go to the startup nation of the world, say Israel.
Israel, of course.
One startup for about 1,400 citizens. If you make an assumption that we have as much brains as anybody else, and we can.
Well, some Israelis may disagree. My friends from the Israeli defense forces and Israeli defense intelligence tell me that they are much more intelligent than anyone else.
Well, reasonable people could disagree, but I'd like to believe that we have as much capability. Then I think we have about, we're 1/10 of the way. Now, what's exciting though is that.
But they're much more literate, Chintan. It's a much more literate country. It is a country which is really deep into technology. Everyone serves in the military and they learn how to work in teams. They're also uniquely integrated with the US in particular. And so there are a lot of advantages that Israel has that no other country really in the world has.
This is true. Now we're getting into the conversation about how to get there, right? And how long will it take? How long will it take is an interesting question because in India, the doubling rate of startups has been 5 years. If I say that we want
from when are you calculating this doubling?
From 2016. From 2016, when we started registering them.
Understood.
So now, if you think of it that way, then it will take us anywhere between 10 and 15 years to get there, for instance.
To get to Israel's level.
To get to that kind of density of startups.
I see.
They may not be similar startups, they may be different startups. What we're learning, there's some very unique things happening in India that in many sectors, problems all over the world are the same. Take healthcare, for example. Problems are the same, but the startups or innovations coming out of India have particularly the affordability dimension of it, which is very pronounced because the innovator is situated in a context. Correct. Where affordability matters a lot.
We are a poorer country. Lest we forget, we've been independent only 75 years, and we began as a socialist country. And so for a long time, we artificially, it was actually socialism that kept India's growth rate in check. And it was ironically called the Hindu rate of growth. It had nothing to do actually with the religion. But that genie is finally out of the bottle. And in healthcare, for instance, so many Americans are coming for operations here because they are cheaper, they are better, the care is superior. You do not have to battle with insurance companies and copay and whatnot. So in many fields, you're right, absolutely. Because it's a poorer country, people are coming up with solutions that are more cost effective. They have to.
Yeah. And nobody hates a cost-effective solution, I've found.
Yeah, that's certainly seems to be the case, huh?
And
Everyone likes a deal, huh? Yeah, go to a U.S. store after Thanksgiving.
Absolutely. And similarly, you mentioned Israel. I'll talk about example of how the school system here is changing. For example, now across India, in 10,000 schools, there are maker spaces. And the design thinking has become one of the most attractive things, attractive subjects.
Yeah, just sorry to interrupt you, but explain to our listeners what is design thinking, because it's very, very, very popular in US circles, in entrepreneurial circles, in academic circles. But someone like my father, who's a brilliant surgeon, doesn't know what design thinking is. So what is design thinking?
So design thinking is, simply put, a structured method to come up with a creative solution to a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
so basically, it is giving structure to the creative
process.
So it focuses the mind.
Exactly, it focuses the mind on divergence first.
Mm-hmm. Focus and flare. So
flare and focus. Mm-hmm. Flare and focus. That's the process that this is, and so. If you look across these schools, these are children of 6th through 12th class.
Standards, so 6 to 12 standards or class, whatever you want to call it.
Grade.
Grade, or our audience is global. So they are between, let's say, 11, 12-year-olds to 17, 18-year-olds.
Right. Now, these maker spaces, think about the schools. There have been 3 waves of labs built in these schools. There was the wave of science labs. There was a wave of computer labs. And now there's the wave of maker spaces.
Mm-hmm. And what's the difference? Please walk people, particularly who are not Indians. What are these 3 waves and when did they take place? Because you are, of course, a computer science professor. So you've presumably at least had experience of one of the waves.
So science labs are physics, chemistry, biology labs that where you do experiments and you prove what is already in a way.
So you prove a theorem, basically. It's the practical application of a certain scientific principle.
Some certain scientific theory.
Yeah.
You're trying to practically prove and see whether that works or not.
For yourself.
Yeah. That's the science lab. The computer lab is where you learn typically how computers work, how programming languages, and you program whatever you want to. The maker spaces are those where something that's in your head can be turned into an artifact. Using a 3D printer, using electronic desk, mechanical desk.
So quite literally, you're making stuff. You're imagining something and then making it. So you didn't answer the question, when did these 3 waves come? So if you could
yes. No,
give a timeline as well.
Actually, to be honest, I don't know the exact years, but the science labs were there from, 60s and 70s and 80s. They were built as a part of these schools for higher grades. The computer labs came about in 80s
I
and
see.
going on to 90s. The maker spaces uh, uh, have been built since 2016 on. In fact, the office that I run in India, Atal Innovation Mission, is the one that built these 10,000 maker spaces.
I see.
Now, we see tremendous amount of creativity coming out of this from schools, primarily because it is in some ways an antithesis to the rest of the educational setting in these schools.
I see. So
Uh, the-
these places have become a refuge from the curriculum, and so the creative sort flock there.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
these are places where there is no exam. These are the only places in schools where the problem comes before a solution comes. In rest of the education, you teach a solution and you ask a problem in the exam so that somebody can repeat the solution you have
Yeah.
taught.
Yeah.
So now the inflection point, quite interestingly, is that now that these three labs are there, recently we have begun to connect them through some purpose. So, for example, recently we connected these 10,000 labs to what are called the agricultural science centers, which have existed for, these are the agricultural extension centers of the government of India, one in every district. We have now connected these maker spaces students to these, they're called Krishi Vigyan Kendras in India. We've connected them to these agricultural science centers so that somebody can begin to learn scientifically about agriculture, but then maybe even use design thinking and come up with something. We're an agrarian nation. 50% of our workforce works in farms. And so these types of, if all over the nation, if you can turn children, this is a very young nation also, as almost 50% of our population is under 25. If you can turn young people to the challenges of the society, use and teach them to use innovation and entrepreneurship to solve these problems, I think we will see something very unique and new, is my hope.
Brilliant. So you sound very positive on the India story. You've voted with your feet. You've moved from MIT to India in your rather resplendent office, I must say.
I had nothing to do with it.
Well,
It was given to me.
exactly. Now you're enthroned as part of the elite guiding India's destiny. But anyway, we've somewhat covered, or at least we've had a 30,000 foot view of the India story. Now, tell us what is going on in G20, because many of these countries, of course, you have the big countries which are all fine. The US has a great innovation system. They have DARPA. They have Silicon Valley. They have the Boston hub where you teach. So they've got a lot going on. Even the Netherlands is not bad. They have extraordinary resilience as well as innovation. And we know the story of the richer countries. What we want to learn is what's going on in say, Brazil or Kenya or Indonesia or Vietnam. Those are the stories we are very particularly keen on.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. This year is a very unique year for the global startup ecosystem because under G20, which is arguably the most action oriented economic forum globally.
Created, by the way, after the financial crisis of 2007, 2008.
Right.
And that is when the G7, the big seven, realized that they themselves alone were not enough. The economic center of gravity was moving both south and east.
Yeah.
And ipso facto, many of these emerging economies that were once called developing countries, and many of them were former colonies, or many of them were colonies, they are former colonies, they were finding their place in the sun. And the G20 was formed. And now this G20 is apparently, according to Chintan, reaching an inflection point in the startup world.
Yes, because, G20 from time to time until now, until this year, did talk about startups, but much of that conversation was under a group called the B20 or the Business 20. Now, Business 20, it also carries the agenda of the large corporations, and there's enough to sort out there. And so,
So it was a big boys club, really.
more or less, and
And the
startups.
big boys sucked the oxygen in the room, and startups got very little spotlight or attention.
Right, right. And even though, I mean, I think there was appreciation for that there should be a conversation about startups, but there was no structure to really give it the
Understood.
attention it needs. This year, as India took on the presidency of the G20, it proposed a new engagement group called the Startup 20 engagement group. Now, this gives startups a platform and equal voice to large corporations. And so, in some ways, the G20 architecture, for the first time, will produce a document that will go to the G20 leaders in terms of how we want the startup ecosystems of nations to come together to create a global startup ecosystem. So, in some ways, it's a historic policy opportunity. Secondly, it makes the G20 architecture what I'd like to call ambidextrous, in that, on one hand, there are these smaller innovative entities called startups that can move fast and take on problems of the world
So they
more
have the
efficiently.
pace.
They have the pace, they have the creative freedom. Um, on the other hand, we have the large corporations that have the scale and capability to take good ideas global. We've seen this combination
And,
in.
and they have the muscle memory. They've done
They've done,
scaling
yes,
before. So they have the
absolutely.
processes, they have the management team, and they
Exactly.
have the reach. They have put in shoe leather over the years to have that ability to scale.
Exactly. And if you think about any problem of global proportion that you care about, be it climate, be it healthcare, what have you, I'd like to submit to you that it would be impossible to solve those problems without having this combination. We saw this. We saw an example of this in during the pandemic times recently, where it was the smaller and the innovative. For example, Oxford came up with a vaccine that AstraZeneca scaled across the globe. BioNTech came with a vaccine that Pfizer scaled across the globe. And it was just that because this process goes on a longer time scale all the time, although it's rather invisible. We have never been sort of deliberate about it. In the pandemic times, we saw it in a microcosm. And I think for many of our global challenges, we will have to leverage this ambidexterity.
So you're saying we'll have to leverage it, and I'm all for it. But a lot of G20 countries, and I know you're in an official position, so I won't take names. I won't get you in trouble.
Thank you.
But a lot of them are former colonies, and they've had, problems with red tape. They lost agency. They developed rent-seeking cultures. They even developed perverse cultures that were culturally against entrepreneurship. In fact, I always give the example of passive voice, which my Mexican friends told me exists not just in the former British colonies, but also in Spanish colonies. And a simple example, when you say it may be considered that this may be done, it may be considered that you may build the road, instead of suggesting, let us build a road here by 2030.
Yeah.
Or I suggest that we build a road by 2030. That simple switch from passive to active voice brings agency, brings confidence, gets people to rediscover their mojo. And are we there? Are countries of the G20 there in terms of, are they ready for this startup fervor? Of course, India is seeing it. You could argue Kenya had M-Pesa, which was mobile payments even before India. So you could argue some countries are seeing it, but is it widespread enough?
So I think we have started on that road.
Okay.
Um, I mean, arguably,
So we've taken the first step. The journey of 100 miles begins with the first step, huh?
exactly. I think if you look at, when people talk about startup ecosystems, they talk about jobs created,
Mm. Yeah.
valuations, all of that.
Valuations is something the media obsesses about.
Right. But to me, I think in a nation like India, and I think many other nations, the thing that a functional startup ecosystem does to the legacy of that nation is that it has created a platform for risk taking for young people that does not exist.
Mhm.
All other institutions, you start with a family, very well meaning. They don't want their children to take risks. They
Mm.
want them to be whatever, doctors, engineers. I don't blame them. I mean, they want them to not take risks. That's why they're doing it. You take corporations, large
Mm.
corporations, risk averse,
Mm.
governments, super risk averse.
Absolutely.
So this is for the first time there's a platform that actually promotes risk taking, and rewards, as we know, are proportional to risks.
So you're basically saying that just as Israel moved from the kibbutz socialist model, where people were, they were very hardworking, but they were largely risk averse when it came to business, certainly not military operations or intelligence gathering, but they were certainly risk averse in business. And then, of course, it exploded into this extraordinary startup nation with new companies, new products, new services, new technologies. You're saying that that is the transition that others have to try and emulate.
Right. That is the transition that we are beginning to see. That is the wave that we're beginning to surf. I think the context today is quite different. Also, that shouldn't be forgotten. In that we have global economic channels. We have democratization of technology. It's more technology, much more accessible. We have the entire educational scene. It's much easier to learn things today than it used to be if you
Mm.
are interested in learning, and so on. So I think it will empower many people. These the tools situated in the right market and policy context.
I see. I see. Before we carry on, but I'd be remiss not to point out that yes, it has become a lot easier to learn. But for the motivated, the cell phone is also highly distracting. And we are also seeing, as you know, Professor Jean Twenge did
Yeah.
this monumental research about a mental health crisis amongst teenagers and high suicide rates in the US.
Right.
So we are also seeing that trend. So I'd be remiss not to point that out and just paint a Pollyannish picture.
Yes. I know. I agree. I mean, I think um, with all technologies, there comes a double-edged sword.
Sword, and I think we'll have to manage them. But you're right. If you're motivated, you can go to edX or Coursera or any of the great learning platforms and practically learn anything
Right.
pretty quickly. So that's certainly true. So yes, learning has become easier. Technology is more distributed, so there'll be more startups. So all of that is true. Do you think these G20 startups will have access to capital? Will capital flow to them?
Oh, that's very interesting. So G20, we started this Startup 20 engagement group. I happen to chair it in January of this year.
January 2023.
2023. And we have so far run an intensely consultative process in that we've had great participation from nations in coming up with what we want to tell the world leaders in this policy communique. And recently, in our third meeting earlier this month, we agreed to call on the G20 leaders to invest $1 trillion by 2030 annually in the global startup ecosystem, which would be a monumental step.
Is it realistic?
It's ambitious, but if we're intent on it, it's doable. I say this because last year, which was somewhat of an unusual year, we had 0.7% of the global GDP, about $700 billion, going into startups. So getting to trillion by 2030 is not impossible, but it requires us to be intentional about it.
All right. This is all jolly good. So hopefully that transpires and there are lots of new ideas that make their way as products and services and
yes, we
based
also
on
came
new
up with
technologies, and that'll net benefit for the world.
yes, we also came up with some very other interesting ideas which we hope to turn into action now. One is to create this global network of nodes like incubators, accelerators, etc., that exists across these nations to unlock finance, for the flow of finance, market access to talent, etc. Similarly, one part of this conversation has focused on SDG startups. And
Sustainable Development Goals, correct?
Sustainable Development Goals focused startups. Now, there are
those are things like clean drinking water, sanitation,
poverty
alleviation. There are 17 of them.
There are 17 of them.
Yeah.
And what was very interesting in terms of the debate was that, as such, any business you ask to map themselves to the Sustainable Development Goals, they will find something or the other that relates to what it is that they do. So, but not. We do know that that's not the way we're going to become.
It could become a box ticking exercise. In fact,
right.
The environment, social, and governance, the ESG model, I'm sure a lot of good comes out of it, but a lot of it is also greenwashing, as people are saying.
Right, exactly. So this conversation has led to a proposal as to what a startup ought to declare for it to be considered an SDG focused startup.
And who considers? Who will be the body who decides? Some bureaucrat sitting in Nairobi or some UN official in New York?
So ideally not.
Okay.
Ideally, such a screen of, a willingness to be measured by impact on one or more SDGs that for which this startup was
there'll be
created.
transparent parameters.
Transparent parameters which are used, ideally, if they are used by the market or the people who invest in startups.
Mm-hmm.
And if it is entirely a market-driven exercise, that is when I feel it will succeed the most. I don't think it will succeed through some regulator somewhere saying thou shalt look at a startup's valuation in this way or that.
Good. So you're a Friedrich von Hayek man.
My own man, but practically, having seen how things work out, this is not an area where we need to induce institutional failure.
Understood. And for that is precisely what Friedrich von Hayek warned in his Road to Serfdom, and he, eventually ended up winning the Nobel Prize long after John Maynard Keynes, who had a slightly different proposition. To be fair, Keynes is misinterpreted because Keynes was a genius too, and he was right in many ways.
And he was right in his times also.
That too, contextual. Exactly. So now that we've had a bit of a philosophical, shall we say, digression, which befits two people who have academic interests, we'll come back to practicality. And Chintan, tell me, what is Startup 20, which you chair apparently, from your fancy office here? What is Startup 20 aiming to do?
So the Startup 20 is hoping that the leaders would take on this idea of $1 trillion by 2030 annually into startups.
So political or business leaders?
Political leaders
Okay.
who will create this enabling environment
Okay. All right. All right.
for
They
this
will
to
not
happen.
crack the whip and tell invest.
No,
Right,
that's yeah.
jump, perform, monkey, perform.
Right.
That would be a strange way to encourage entrepreneurship.
That would be a strange way to encourage entrepreneurship. But we also have come up with several other global sort of. Well, I already told you about the global network, but a global definitional framework. I was telling you about the components of what a startup definition could be.
Yes, we began the podcast with that. Yeah, legal
right.
entity, technology.
Yeah, and so similarly, we have said there can be a governance. What a governance framework for a startup can be. Typically, what happens is when you're a startup, you say, "Well, initially, I have to figure myself out, so I'm not going to worry about good governance."
Yes,
but what has happened is that in industry after industry, it is really take IT industry of India, for example. It is not India's IT prowess alone that has led to a global market for it. It is really giving the world the confidence that these people can be trusted. Their governance standards are rigorous and transparent, and so on. And I think we're trying to take startups in that direction. Only then will it become a legitimate component of the global trade. So that's one, advocating for some global due diligence standards. Because again, valuation, the value has nothing to do with valuation often. That's a problem. We have to solve that problem.
That goes back, you could argue, to human nature, the South Sea bubble, the tulip bubble.
Yeah.
So we have seen those bubbles forever. I mean, look at the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Derivatives were soaring sky high, and it turned out to be a bubble. So that's difficult. I was in the city in London. I saw that bubble from the inside. So,
yeah. No, I think so. I mean, if we were to succeed, the lessons from the bubbles would be to how not to have a bubble,
or at least
understand that this is a bubble.
Exactly, or at least to have more transparency. So you have less crazy bubbles and less inflated startups. Because we saw what happened with Theranos.
Right. So I think there's conversation about it, which is good. And then finally, there's much conversation in Startup 20 about how to make startup ecosystems more inclusive of those groups that are underrepresented.
And that is a difficult problem, because even today in Silicon Valley, you have the great success of the Indians, of course, the Russians, and of course Israelis and Jewish people, and of course you have the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the WASPs, who've done well. But even in the US, for all the efforts, you have an underrepresentation of African Americans and Native Americans, and so that's a tricky problem, isn't it?
It's a tricky problem, and every nation, bar none, has some or the other underrepresented group. And this is, again, intimately tied to what we were discussing earlier, the culture of risk-taking, the ability to take risks, the infrastructure and support so that somebody can take risk. All of this, we will have to, as we build, we'll have to be mindful of those who are even more underprivileged.
So, Chintan, you're sounding like Max Weber. You're really burying Karl Marx 6 feet under now.
Well, I think there should be space for everybody.
Excellent. So, what you're saying is the culture of risk-taking and the support structure for risk-taking is supremely important. And over time, were that to happen, you would have less underrepresentation of groups. Those groups can be lifted up.
Right. I think if they become economically better off, then it will lead to some form of equality. Even equality is not one. Equity is not one. Sorry,
let's not get into that. But I think more importantly, because we are living at a time of massive inequality and rising inequality globally, particularly in the US. So I think The key thing,
But
correct me.
opportunity.
Yeah, the key thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You've hit this. You've said precisely the word that I was going to say. Opportunity. What you're saying is that as they become more prosperous and as they have more access to knowledge and as they can tap into networks and as, let's say, poorer kids in India and elsewhere can play around in places like these maker spaces,
Yeah.
then there is a chance that one or two, three, four, or more might create great companies, and maybe even globally successful companies.
Yes, indeed. I have full faith it'll happen.
Excellent. On that high note, ladies and gentlemen, we will bid you adieu. If you like this podcast, make sure you like us, rate us, subscribe to us, and share our podcast with your friends. So, from a very, very nice office, although now a sweltering office because we've shut off the air conditioning, from Atul Singh, it is bye for now.
Thank you very much, Atul, for having me.
Thank you, Chintan.